everyone. Doc T here with another podcast. I'm really so grateful that you're all here listening. And if you're on YouTube, you're watching me, that's great. Um, I've got some notes here. You guys can see them. I've been listening to a couple of presentations by veterinarians. This one was presented through the Florida Veterinary Medical Association. I paid 25 bucks and I got continuing education credits for it. And I keep falling to the same mistake because these these presentations, these webinars are basically mouthpieces for a company trying to promote something that they have. And this topic that they decided to do was called equine asthma. And equine asthma is an interesting name because I used to call it heaves. Then we got fancy and called it COPD, which stood for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And then they had inflammatory airway, and then recurrent airway disease or something like that. They just come up with all these names. And they've now currently settled on the term equine asthma because they're realizing that it's almost identical to human asthma. So why not call it what it is? I've got a lot of information on this in my head from experience, but I'm going to walk you through this according to the notes that I took. Again, see, I paid attention. I went to a lot of, I'm going to have a bunch of podcasts that are based on these things, on the other diseases and information that these people are having. And it's going to be fun. Okay, equine asthma. Basically what happens is the horse is unable to exhale. So inhalation is usually not a problem, but exhalation is a push because as they push the air through the airways, they have constricted. So a normal airway is this big, it's constricted, and there's no flow. Now, I'm going to touch a little bit on physics because I love physics. The area of a circle is 2 pi r, which is 2 times the number pi, which is 3.14, etc., times the radius. And every time you reduce the radius by just a smidgen, you're going to vastly affect the area of the circle. And every tube is basically a circle that has length. And that's going to decrease the amount of airflow that's going to get through the trachea or the bronchi or the alveoli, way down there in the bottom of the lungs. Everything shrinks up and air can't get through. And in addition, there is a rippling effect, an inflammatory response that's going on. So you don't have a smooth flow. It's called laminar flow, which means if you have a hose that's this big, and a hose could be an airway or it could be a, a blood vessel, or your garden hose that you're filling your water tubs up with. And if it gets smaller, obviously less stuff is going to come through. But worse with laminar flow, the outer edges have friction. So the fluid that's moving through has to rub up against that edge, and it decreases in velocity. And it also increases with turbulence because instead of having a smooth airway or passageway, it's ripple like cobblestones, and it starts to make noise. And in fact, this is the reason behind a lot of the all airway diseases making noise. But in this case, the horse tries to push the air out and he can't. And it sounds like that whistling sound as they try to push it out, and their muscles of their chest or abdomen really push hard as they're trying to push this air out. And over time, they hypertrophy or enlarge that exterior muscle. And you can see what we always call the heave line. And that's basically the horse is lifting weights, if you will, causing that muscle to grow and become larger. So that's the reason why they have a heave line. Anyway, so moving on, they said that basically it's a hyper-responsive disease with the most predominant part being the inflammation that occurs. And they consider that the factors in the environment are the trigger. But what was fascinating is in a barn full of horses, there may be one or two that have these triggers, and and most of the other horses aren't having a problem. Triggers, in my mind, are dust. So if you're blowing out the barn, consider that. Even sweeping the barn, consider that. Think about dusty hay that wasn't processed correctly. Molds. Molds are everywhere. Molds are just so toxic to humans and horses and everything else. And we keep them inside a barn with the windows closed. And they're exposed to all these molds that can set off the toxins as well. And if your hay is moldy or your food is moldy. So all of those factors, if you're a smoker and you blow the smoke in your horse's face, why are you smoking in the barn? Don't ask. There are people that do it, but smoke is a trigger for humans as well. And of course, pollution, when you live in an urban area and the air quality starts to become poor, that can be a trigger for some of these horses too. Then they talk about genetic predisposition. To me, that's a garbage pail. I'm sorry. Genetics, you and I have all the genetics we want to make any disease we want, all the cancers that we have. It's all genetically based. There's no doubt. The question is, what are the triggers that make your genes express themselves to create that disease? And that's called epigenetics. And you'll hear me say this a million times. Epigenetics is the problem, not genetics. I always say that it's not genetics that cause heart disease in your family. It's eating like you've always have, like your parents and grandparents and great grandparents did. That's what's causing your heart disease. Not so much the genetics. But yes, there are predispositions. I believe there are predispositions for all diseases, whether you are, thoroughbreds or Arabs or, gosh, see, I don't have any political correctness here if I say Arabs or thoroughbreds or, Appaloosas or, but if I start naming races of humans, you'll get all upset with me. So the bottom line is the different breeds of species can be predisposed. There's no doubt about it. Through breeding, we can get chinks in the armor and we can get some genetic predispositions. So I guess that's a possibility, but I don't think in equine asthma, that's not it. I mean, that's it. Okay, they also talked about infections, bacterial or virus, or sometimes unknown diseases that just creep in. That's a possibility, I guess. I had viral pneumonia in 5th grade, so I was just a youngin', and I suffered from human asthma, which I got all the hyperallergy testing. I almost died. I know somebody who did die of asthma. It's not a pretty disease. It's not fun. It scares the crap out of you. And for me, I was fine until I moved to California and lived there for 3 or 4 or 5 months. And I was exposed to something out there that I didn't know of. And when I came back to the East Coast, I was immediately affected by, of all things, straw that we use for bedding on our horses. And I would shake that up and I would just be unable to breathe. And I crawled upstairs to my 2nd floor apartment and laid in the bed and literally thought, this is it. I was dead. I could not breathe anymore. So I got the inhalers. I went to an allergist and had x-rays done of my lungs and went through the allergy testing. And just a funny side note, when I went to get my interview at vet school, there's these very stern looking men there to scare the, whatever out of you, to make sure that the applicant, me, would be too scared to express myself. And so one of them turned and looked at me with all seriousness and he says, we all understand that you have an interest in horses and you want to become a veterinarian for horses, but what would happen if you, for instance, became allergic to horses and couldn't work with them anymore? I laughed so hard, I almost fell out of my chair. And these men are looking at me like, what is wrong with this guy? And in essence, I said, been there, done that. And here I am. And at that point, the whole interview was over. We just started laughing, telling stories. I was in there for almost an hour as the last applicant of the day. And we just talked horse stories. And I got into vet school. And here I am, umpteen years later. 40 years. Wow. 37. Okay, let's not push everything here. Okay, so now they talk about particulates, specifically organic particulates, and they said if they're less than 5 nanometers. Now, most of us don't even know what a millimeter is, but these are smaller than a millimeter by like 1,000, and you can fit 25 millimeters into an inch. So they're pretty small. They're molds, fungi, or fungi, depends how you want to pronounce it, pollen, endotoxins, plant fragments, chemicals, and bad ventilation. I said, okay, they're not telling me anything we don't already know. This is the amazing. At this point of the lecture, I'm like, all right, where's the new stuff? And then she talked about in the Southeast something called pasture-associated equine asthma, which is an adult onset, usually after 7 years of age. And it's usually late summer or the fall. That's, of course, when some of the pollens and molds are pretty much rampant, especially down here because it's our rainy season. And some of these horses just start getting asthmatic. Please hold on to that thought. Put a little check mark there. Older than 7, late summer to fall. If any of you know me, you know I'm thinking something about nutrition. And I'm going to come back to that at the very end. So hold on to that. Okay, they said diagnosis is physical exam, use a rebreathing bag. Like, you can just stand there and listen to them, they're going, they can't breathe out. But if you want to do that, then they have some endoscopies. Of course, you got to break the endoscope out because you've got a payment on it. No offense to veterinarians. I'm sure that these are important, but they rate them on a scale of 0 to 6. With a decreased ability to exercise or the increased score. No kidding. They can't get air. Then they do a tracheal wash on it, and it's good if you want to look for bacterial culture. But if you want to do something called a BAL, which is called bronchoalveolar lavage, which basically means through the scope, they send a tube down into the far reaches of your lungs, and they squirt a little bit of sterile saline in there, and then they draw it out. And they'll look at the cells. Now, I was always taught that they have 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that's interesting because they basically didn't say this, but they look for neutrophils, mast cells, eosinophils, and these are particular types of white blood cells in the horse. And based on the numbers that they see and the amounts or the ratios that they have, they will score your horse. I will tell you right now that 1 and 2 are treatable, 3 and 4 are not. That's just my experience. And they didn't say that in this webcast, but it comes from something that I did a long time ago. In fact, if you go to page 20 of a Google search on my name, you might even see the report with my name on it, because I was one of the original testers for Ventapulmin, which many of you have heard of. Ventapulmin is an oral syrup that can be given to horses to help them expand their lungs. And part of that study was we gave atropine, and atropine is a crazy drug in a horse. If you give a whisper of atropine to a horse that's got heaves, they will stop heaving in about a nanosecond. Like within a snap of your fingers, they just start going, they breathe without any obstruction, and they become so happy, and it lasts for minutes. I mean, by 10 minutes, they're back to breathing hard again. But as a warning, if you give more than a whisper, which means like 1.5 whispers of atropine to a horse, it'll also stop their gut from moving. And that stoppage, that stop of the peristaltic movement will send your horse into such excruciating pain that you're almost at the point of euthanizing it. And I know because it happened to me. It happened to my own personal horse that I gave the atropine to. And that pony, basically, I walked out with a syringe filled with euthanasia solution, ready to euthanize it. It was in such agony. And it looked at me and said, "Get that thing away from me, give me some food." And it was just a miracle. Just approaching the horse with a euthanasia solution got him out of it. But yeah, atropine is amazing. And what I found was there are some horses that you give atropine to, and these guys would not respond at all. And it was just phenomenal. And I thought that if you gave atropine to a horse and it responded, it probably would work well with any bronchodilator that you gave it, whatever medication you might want to use, whether it's the syrup or the inhalation form through an inhaler, that'll work. But if it gets into 3 or 4 category, and even though we didn't do the BALs back then, they were non-responsive to atropine. They're also non-responsive to the bronchodilators. So if you're administering bronchodilators to your horse and they're not responding, it's probably because they're more severe than they seem, and a BAL will prove that to you if you want to do it. All right, so they went on to the treatment part, and they said there's 3 treatments. Step 1 is remove the triggers. No duh. I mean, like, come on, are you serious? Yeah, it's sometimes the most obvious thing is sometimes overlooked. And I was actually saying, well, yeah, remove the cause. I mean, remove the pollution, remove the smoker that's blowing the smoke in the horse's face, remove the moldy food, soak the hay, wash the hay, get the horse outside away from confinement where he has better ventilation, keep the horse inside in a air-conditioned stall if it's pollens that are outside, move the horse, ship it 100,000 whatever miles away from home to a different area where it have better air. So it's number 1, remove the cause. Number 2, they said control the airway inflammation, and their primary goal for that are glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids are a drug that most of you know as dexamethasone or prednisone. And the 2 drugs are very similar in the way they act. Just think of dexamethasone as being 10x or 10 times more potent than prednisone. So if you give 1 dex, you give 10 prednisone, and you'll get the same effect. The nice thing about prednisone is you can reduce it and adjust the medication to 1/10 of a dexamethasone shot, and you'll have better control. Anyway, they all believe that glucocorticoids work, but they did say give it a month to work. It may not work overnight. I think you and your veterinarian have to work very closely to adjust the dose to find what dose is perfect for your horse. And I've seen some horses on a dose of dexamethasone just immediately become better. So that's obviously something you and your vet have to work for. There are serious side effects, including, and not limited to, but most importantly, creating laminitis in your horse. If your horse is insulin resistant and is predisposed, has had bad experiences, laminitis in the past, adding glucocorticoids will not help. So you have to be very careful. I'd be more cautious or more willing to use prednisone than dexamethasone. But again, that's between you and your vet. And then the third part of the 3-part approach is if the triggers are removed, that doesn't work. You add glucocorticoids and that doesn't work, then control the bronchospasms with these medications that are either inhaled or poured down their throat orally, and see if we can stop the spasms that are going on in the bronchi. All right. Good, I'm on to page 2. I only have 1 more page. I like one side of 1 page because this kind of fizzled out, and we're moving along here. So hopefully you aren't getting bored of this. Then there's nebulizers. There's airbags that you can put over the horse's face. There's been multiple ones. I'll never forget the first one that came out. The what was it called? Was it the Aero Mask? I just remember that it's very expensive because they had to get FDA approval to use this as a metered system. And we tried all different sorts of steroids or anti-bronchospasm drugs. that we would put in orally and get down in the lungs. The biggest problem with them is application, and were these drugs actually getting down in the lungs and being used effectively. And with some horses, yes, some horses, no. And they came out with all sorts of different things. And this is where this presenter who worked for Boehringer Ingelheim, who makes something called the Azervo Equil. Gosh, I'm so sorry. I wrote this down in sloppy words. Equihaler, the Azervo Equihaler. Anyway, what's really interesting is a couple things there. It's eco-friendly. So instead of it using a gas, it actually uses a spring. So if you're in thinking that you don't want to use any pressurized gases, this is overcoming that. So that was kind of cool. The other thing is they use a glucocorticoid called, oh gosh, I'm horrible at pronouncing these, cyclosinide. And cyclosinide is what they call a prodrug, which means it goes in as a precursor to a drug. It has very, very low dexamethasone-like activity. In fact, if they said if you gave dexamethasone a score of 100, then this particular drug, CICLESONIDE, cyclosinide, they would have a score of 12, which means it's 1/10 the power of dexamethasone. So you're going to say, well, what's the point of that? Well, what's really cool about this is when it gets down into the lungs, it has the ability to be enzymatically converted into CIC. CIC is cyclosinide inhalation drug, cyclosinide. Anyway, they call it CIC. And it becomes DES-CIC, which has 1,200 or 12 times the power of dexamethasone acting locally. So I think that's just phenomenal. And I think that's a really good thing. It's FDA approved, it's safe. And what they proved in their studies was that there's no increase in serum cortisol, which is great news for your laminitic horses. And I think that's something that you and your vet need to look into. Let's see. Then they went on a couple of things. Oh, they said equine asthma is not a histamine-mediated disease, so antihistamines are not effective. And that's really important because when I went to that small rinky-dink upstate New York vet school called Cornell, sorry, you can tell a Cornell vet, but you just can't tell them much. Anyway, my pharmacology teacher said histamines in horses don't act at all like histamines in any other species. The mast cells release histamine long after the fact. And that's why I kind of laugh when vets give dexamethasone to horses with hives, because the event's over. And now we're trying to treat an event where the event's over. And I know you guys are saying, well, we give the dex and the hives go away. I get it. But they're also giving antihistamines. And I'm like, that's just not working well. But that's what people do. And, but that's just my thoughts. And again, you and your vet have to go over these things. If you don't want to give antihistamines, that's fine. She said it in there, it's not a histamine related disease. So giving antihistamines, I think Benadryl and things like that just aren't effective. What was that? Antihistamine, what was that called? Oh gosh, there's an injectable one. Oh, it's right on the tip of my tongue. I can see it. Equihis granules, that's not going to work at all. It's just not going to help. Then she went into allergy testing, and she and I agree. There's no good evidence for it. To do allergy testing in a horse for asthma is not going to gain you anything, and I couldn't agree more. But again, you and your vet have to discuss these things. And if your vet has had a different approach to it, it's worth listening to him or her and get their ideas and thoughts on it. Now, that was the end of her presentation. And I ended up typing in a question to her, and she's answering all these questions. And then she gets to my question, and she says, "Oh my gosh, this is a great question." I'm like, Yeah, I know. Because my question was, in humans, they are associating human asthma with insulin resistance. You knew I couldn't help it. You knew I was going to get to insulin resistance. It's just everything boils down to the inflammation caused by insulin resistance. And if you recall, with insulin resistance, insulin is increased because they're trying to push the glucose into the muscle cells to get rid of it. And the muscles are shutting down and not allowing the insulin to do its job. So the insulin is taking the glucose molecule and it's going back to the fat room. I'm now calling fat cells the fat room because I want you to understand that you don't add more fat cells. You just put more fat into the fat cell. So the fat cell just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And just keep thinking of you're sitting in your room all alone, and then a couple of friends stop by and it's kind of cozy. And then their friends come by and now it's getting a little crowded and you're getting cramped. And now there's 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 people sitting in your same room and you can't even breathe. You become inflamed. And this is what happens to these fat cells. They send out these inflammatory cells. And my thoughts are all inflammatory diseases, which equine asthma certainly falls into that category, has got to be inflammation related. I mean, don't you think? Because the number one drug you're giving is anti-inflammatories, steroids, in fact, to really put the kibosh on the inflammatory response that your horse goes, oh boy, do I feel better. Well, that's what glucocorticoids do. They make you feel better in the short run, and in the long run, they deplete you, and your inflammation has not been, the cause of inflammation has gone away. So my hypothesis is that if we start looking at asthmatic horses, we would also look for insulin resistance. And again, I can't stress this enough. Insulin resistance can start in humans at least a decade before any blood work says, hey, you're insulin resistant. So my rule of thumb is if you see fat on a body, then insulin is taking glucose and storing it there. So insulin is working as long as the horse is gaining fat. So if there's more fat accumulation on the body and it's getting bigger, that's because insulin is there. And you want to eliminate insulin at least for part of the day and certainly part of the year, which brings me right back to page 1. I love rustling papers on a microphone. Doesn't it sound great? What happened to page 1? I stuck it onto the bottom. Page 1, I said that it's there, it's here someplace. I talked about pasture-related equine, there it is, pasture-related associated equine asthma. And I said greater than 7 and usually late summer and fall. And guess what happens late summer or fall? The sugar content of all your pastures has increased. And many of us don't stop feeding hay, even though the pasture is getting richer and richer in glucose content or starch content or non-structural carbohydrate content, whatever you want to call it. So it seems to me obvious that you're going to have a spike in asthma in horses that are turned out on pasture because they are increasing their plane of nutrition and they're gaining body fat because winter's coming. And my hypothesis is if you were able to prevent that from happening, to manage their weight so they never gain excess fat, that they just have a basic fat covering to get them through the winter, and they use that fat covering, I'm guessing that you're going to see a drop in insulin and therefore an improvement in insulin sensitivity, which is the opposite of insulin resistance. And I'll bet you that some of these asthmatic horses will probably start to improve because the causes of inflammation are gone. That is all I have to say about equine asthma. And I'm so glad you stopped by to hear this podcast. I love getting all these pieces of information from everybody else and putting it out there. And of course, if you think that this is good, The real meat and potatoes is at thehorsesadvocate.com. Become a member. Yes, it's a shameless plug. I'd love for you to become a member because that's how you get to ask me questions about this podcast. It's how you get to dig in and find more answers, to tell us all what you have done with decreasing inflammation to remove equine asthma. We also get to have a monthly webinar where you can listen to some of these things in more depth. Anyway, so thanks again for joining, and thanks for being a part of this. I am so grateful. All right, that's about it. I'm going to sign off, and I hope you enjoyed your moments listening to me and cleaning your stalls or driving your car, wherever. And remember, Apple, Androids, Amazons, Googles. If you don't like any of them, you got Stitcher, Deezer, and Spotify. My podcast is on all of them. Go to one of those and subscribe so you don't miss one of these. Thanks, Doc T out. Bye.
Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.